I want to say thank you ahead of time to our interpreters who have been doing incredible work. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to sit here with you and have a chance to speak with Isabella Hammad about her novel, Enter Ghost. It is an absolutely beautiful and riveting book set in Palestine in the West Bank. And it is a story about a group of actors, theater actors, and their director who decide that they are going to put on a play of Hamlet in the West Bank. This is a play, or this is a book about many things. It's about this determination to make this play, to produce it on occupied territory. But it's also about the main character, Sonia, who is Palestinian, British, Dutch mother, understanding more about her family history, the stories of exile, return, perhaps also staying, remaining in place, and what happens in each of those threads. I'd like to begin by just asking Isabella a few questions about the origin of this idea of setting a novel in the West Bank, but also constructing it around the production of a play and of Hamlet. So, Isabella, it's my pleasure to talk to you. But could you tell us a bit about how this idea came to you? Why Hamlet? And why Palestine?
Well, first of all, it's my great pleasure to be here in such great company. So thank you so much. It's such a delight. And thank you for the question. So the novel's not only set in the West Bank, it's also set in Haifa, and also it has part of it takes place in Jerusalem, and even in Akka at the very beginning. So part of the the design of the novel was to incorporate many areas of historic Palestine and to look at the ways in which Palestinians living under different legal status in different circumstances, how they all relate to one another in the putting on of this play. So that's one of the ideas behind the novel. And I wanted to write a novel about putting on a play. I thought it would be a formal challenge, and dancing about architecture. And it would allow me to talk about modern day Palestine and to kind of using the metaphor of performance and thinking about the performance of power, the performance of resistance. I wanted to exercise that metaphor, or what it allowed me to do in all sorts of different ways. So it enabled me to play quite a lot. I realized I should speak slower for the interpreter. I was interested for a long time in the history of theatre in Palestine. There was a documentary that I saw when I was a teenager called Arna's Children, which is about a theatre school for children in Jenin refugee camp, set up by an Israeli communist called Arna Mer, whose son, Giuliano Mer Khamis, Palestinian father, turned into the Freedom Theatre. And this film deliberately collapses the idea that making theatre is cathartic, or that it's therapeutic in some way, that it will therapize these children out of their anger. And many of the children who are in the theatre school then go on to join the armed struggle and participate in the Second Intifada. So it's quite a provocative and very affecting film. And that was the beginning of my interest in this art form that is seen as very dangerous, that is where you can go off script, that is spontaneous, that involves crowds. And it allowed me to talk about all sorts of things in the novel through a kind of slightly indirect means or in a playful way. And I chose Hamlet. Took me a while to get to Hamlet. I chose it because lots of people know about Hamlet. People know the plot. They know there's a ghost. And because it has an interesting history in the Arab world. Many sort of, performances of Shakespeare plays outside of Britain, and even now in Britain, are kind of talking back to Shakespeare. They do a post-colonial reading of Shakespeare. They tell the story from Caliban's perspective and so on. But Hamlet, interestingly, is a kind of anti-colonial hero in a certain kind of a way. He's fighting against an illegitimate regime. And he has an interesting, the play has an interesting performance history across the world. And in the Middle East, a particular history in Egypt, in Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, where it was seen as the play of high seriousness, and to be or not to be was a kind of slogan for a political coming to consciousness on the world stage. And so that was very interesting to me. And then I learned it had been banned also in the Israeli prisons because it was seen as a dangerous play, to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, sort of like a call to arms. So I thought, oh, there's lots here I can play around with. So that was the way in.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. I was interested in what you said, this idea of a political coming to consciousness. And it felt to me that I could see Sonia's progression, her political awareness growing. Perhaps we could say the closer she came to maybe the West Bank, she leaves the UK and goes to her sister's place in Haifa, still learning about herself, still in a sense working through a broken relationship, still grappling with the tensions between her and her sister Hanin. And as she, in a sense, crosses these borders that you talk about across this territory, she comes closer and closer to family secrets, but also understanding certain things about herself, which I thought was done so beautifully. I wondered if you could talk about these border crossings that seem to show up in many different ways across the book, quite literally, and I think Samantha mentioned this in her talk, but also Olga Tokurczyk was talking about territories and borders in her lectio yesterday in a beautiful way. And in this novel too, we see, as you mentioned, moving from 48 Palestine into these different areas with all their different rules. See if you can follow me. I think Isabella can. And then I was really interested in the way that the structure of the book was also, in a sense, breaking a border or breaching a border, where we have a novel that is written like a novel, but all of a sudden the characters will suddenly break into a play form, and the form changes and becomes like the structure of the book changes, and the dialogue moves into the play form. And so I thought of that also, these constant breachings of borders, creations of them. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
Of course, I love this question. The first thing that's important to say is that these are not borders, actually. They're checkpoints on an illegally occupied land. But more and more the Israelis have made the checkpoints feel a bit like airports. So they make them look like they're borders. And in fact, it's like they even have signs, I think in one of the Bethlehem checkpoints, it says, "Thank you for your visit." It's like these are workers crossing, who have a permit to go and work in 48 and in Israel. And then to return to their homes in the West Bank. So they're not borders. And I think that that's a very important thing to remember, that all of these so-called borders in this area of the world were imposed by Western imperial powers against the consent of the native population. And the relationships among the people who live on the land, whose families have lived there for centuries, remain. There's still family links. There's still... And that's something I'm really interested in, looking at the sociality of those relationships and the complication of those relationships. People in Gaza, most of them are refugees from other parts of Palestine, and a lot of, sort of family links are, continue to permeate historic Palestine and the diaspora. So that tension and drama is something that I was very interested in thinking about, and in showing that what to an international audience they think. Some people think Gaza is a separate country, it's not. It's an occupied territory full of refugees who are now refugees many times over. So that was something that certainly I wanted to play with. I went recently, a few years ago, I went to the Golan Heights for the first time, which is occupied Syrian territory, occupied in 1967 by Israel. And we stood and looked at it was a very strange experience to be on this so-called border. We're looking for the place in the grass where does Syria begin? Where does the Israeli occupation start? It's somewhere in the grass near the UN building and so on. And if you'll indulge me, I then had a dream about it. I had a dream that I had to give a lecture on writing to my students in Palestine, and I couldn't think what to write about. And I had this image of standing in the Golan Heights, looking for the border in the grass, and realizing that the border is not real. Kind of having this realization, I'm on occupied territory here. And there was something there for me about writing as well, about this borderlessness you talk about, this sort of sense of moving between things, which is very freeing as a writer, to think that the boxes we try and put things in actually might not be real. We can step outside them.
Yeah.
And also to look at the ground we're standing on, to always be honest about where we stand. This is a very important political point for me.
It's interesting also that Sonia has to contend with that. This question of those who left, those who had to leave, those who stayed within the same family, and the many, I don't want to say just tensions, but the complicated layers of love that develop across the family members. There's Sonia and her sister Hanin, but there's also Sonia's reckoning with her father's past and her uncle's past, and then thinking also to the Nakba and her grandparents' history with that. And they all seem to flow through Sonia, and she's had to deal with, she's in a sense dealing with the legacies of all of this at the same time as trying to contend with her own life and her own loves and complications, even in the UK. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about Sonia's reckoning with her family's histories and secrets, and their own reckonings, which I thought was done really beautifully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm generally very interested in the human capacity for change. And I think it's kind of an old-fashioned thing to write a novel where the character changes, a character arc, But I'm really interested in that, and one of my intentions with this novel was to write a character who changes over the course of it, who becomes oriented in a certain way, who encounters her own wrongness, who is confronted with things she didn't understand about herself or about her family. And I find that very, very profound when I discover that I'm wrong about something. It's like I become aware, it's sort of a bulwark against solipsism. There are other people out there, and you can be wrong. And I think that's something that literature can give us, is to stage that experience of change, and to model it as well. So that was in the design, certainly, and certainly it's partly to do with a lot of haunting. There's a lot of ghosts in the novel.
I think Rashid is, in many ways, the heart of this story, or, for me, felt very central to understanding even the role of the imagination, the many forms of resistance that one can take when everything seems to be controlled. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about him and his hunger strike. And I can't help connecting this also to the imagination at work in occupied territory. And maybe I'll just leave that and see if you can talk about that.
Yes. The character of Rashid is a young man in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, who Sonia and her sister Hanin meet during the first intifada, or at the end of the first intifada. Their uncle takes them. And it's a formative moment for both sisters, and it affects them very differently. Hanin, the older sister, becomes politically committed through this experience of seeing this boy who's about to die. And Sonia decides, I don't want anything to do with this. Partly because she connects, so she has a moment where she feels very connected to the boy, and it's traumatic, and she says, I walk away from anything Palestinian, and I don't want to go back to the West Bank ever. And so that's a kind of central node in the tension in the relationship between the sisters that has significance later on. And I suppose, yes, what you're saying about hunger strikes, there's something about hunger striking that seems paradoxical, that a prisoner will refuse food and water, or refuse food, sometimes there's water, and threaten their own life, and that then the prisoner, sorry, the prison guard or the prison or the jailer, wishes to save the life of the prisoner. There seems to be a paradox at play here, and I think that's quite interesting to think about what the constraints on a person who is so entirely oppressed that they have nothing at their disposal to fight back with. All they can control is what enters and exits their body. That's the only territory over which they remain sovereign. So it's actually a fight for sovereignty over the body. This for me is very significant. The prisoners' movement is at the heart of the Palestinian struggle, and it sometimes gets forgotten because we don't see the prisoners, right? But it was very important for me to stage that, and to stage that seeming paradox, and to kind of engage with it, especially when the situation is so bad, and thinking about what it means to continue to resist in such circumstances.
Thank you for that. I couldn't help thinking as I was reading this novel, the many questions that you are raising about the place and the power of the imagination, both on occupied territory, but in moments of violence, under authoritarianism. And you have written nonfiction pieces also addressing this, what the use of words, what is the place of literature, for example, during this ongoing genocide, what can we say or what can we do in the face of something that just feels overwhelmingly oppressive and ongoing? And I wondered if you could talk a bit about maybe particularly Miriam, who is the director of this play of Hamlet in the novel, and who is just absolutely determined that this will happen. This play will get made no matter what, even as things are starting to close in on them gradually. And I kept thinking, this is not just about Mariam fighting against this system. There is something here about creativity and imagination. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, but I would love to hear you maybe extend that into your thinking that went into the essay, the book, Recognizing the Stranger, which was also about language during a time of genocide.
Sure. Yeah, the putting on of the play. Mariam is quite kind of, this character is, she's a bit of a character, as they say, and she's very forthright and, but also a little naive, or she has a kind of romantic idea of what theatre, in an age of screens, there's this idea that we're going to put on a Hamlet, we're going to put on a very serious, important play. But because she wants to get a big audience, she casts a pop star as Hamlet who doesn't know how to act. So she's kind of caught between this high-low thing where she's trying to revive this theatre, this art form that was very significant to the Palestinian Revolution in a previous decade. In the 1970s, theatre was very important. And it's not so much anymore. It's very NGO-ized. All the funding comes from European bodies and so on. So she's trying to revive this raw, more vital form of the art. And the novel is a kind of, in a way, a dialectical engagement with this question of what is the role of art, or does it have a role, or are we being romantic about it, or is it a cop-out? Is it a way of avoiding other forms of struggle that that will represent it? What is the function of representation? And Sonia, the protagonist, is quite cynical about it, but the novel itself makes another kind of argument. So those two things sort of exist in tension. and the actors are debating it all the time. How do we interpret the play, and so on. So it's not that I settle on an answer in the novel at all, but it's part of the substance of the text that it engages this question. Strangely, since the genocide, I actually have a stronger faith in the role of the arts, which is almost just simpler. I think it's very important in. I think art is very important to political struggle. I think it's very important for the ways we relate to one another. It's very important for feelings of community, for identification. All of these very simple things, which I fear sometimes become cliches when we talk about literature, and we can overemphasize the value at the expense of other forms of activities. But I think it's very vital, and you can see that from all the literature that's come out of Gaza. I mean, just incredible writing and art making and dancing. I mean, it's a way of staying alive, which is hugely significant, of course.
Yeah, thank you. I will open it up for a question or two if anyone has one, and if not, I have more questions. Back there.
In recognizing the stranger, you have a sense of where you talk about getting the right fire, and the idea of, instead of educating Westerners about Palestine and ourselves, speaking amongst ourselves and letting them listen. And I read Recognizing After I read Mr. Ghost, but I thought a lot about that in terms of Sonia and Annie, but also in terms of their silences. And there's a lot of points in the book where they don't speak to each other, and that's where the dialogue is happening. And so I wondered, it's just something I wondered about in reading Recognizing, how you thought about that in general when it comes to the way novels can be a place to do that, but also in terms of Sonia and Annie.
That's beautiful, thank you. I don't think I thought about it in relation to Sonia and Haneen's relationship, but that makes sense. I mean, my point there, drawing from Yasmin's point in her book, Radius, amazing book about a militant feminist group in Tahrir Square in Egypt, is that it's actually more, more rhetorically effective, actually, to not seek to persuade in this direct way, which is what Palestinians have been doing and still do, which is, please recognize I'm a human being and I deserve life and freedom. That speech act is a very familiar one, and it hasn't worked very well. And what I felt or began to feel is that our speech and our ideas become much more sophisticated when we talk to each other and we allow other people to overhear. We're not seeking to persuade in some direct way, but actually it's more effective. And there might be just debate and so on, but actually that is the better way to educate others. Obviously, this requires translation, so that's where translation comes into it. But that was what I was thinking about there in that lecture, which I wrote after I had finished. Enter Ghost. But as for the sisters, they don't talk. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that they don't talk to each other and they walk around these silences. And I think that happens in families. You get so used to a silence that it feels, to talk about borders, like you're crossing a border to breach that silence. And I think in families where there is a great deal of pain and oppression and trauma, that is even more the case. So I also wanted to stage those breaches in the novel. But it was less about having an audience. It's really about them talking to each other. Yeah. Thank you.
Don't know if maybe one hand. Thank you. The last question. Oh, is this?
One because I haven't read the movie yet. I come from the harbor of the selection from Conversazione. So, quite unusual to hear say some things that I have really novel. I mean, I'm not the only one who's written about this before.
Well, I have to say thank you for that. Thank you for this. I feel like if you read the books, this is very interesting. If you read the novels of all of these finalists and then all of the jury members, you are going to find these overlaps. I think this is why they were finalists. Because we are in constant conversation, all of us, with these questions, whether it comes out in the same way or structure or not. And so I feel in having read, of course, Isabella's book, but all of these other books, there was so much that resonates. And in some ways, the questions that I ask in the book that you're saying they were becoming more complicated because of what I was reading from this year. So thank you for recognizing that. But one very quick last question, and then we will close this out. And thank you all so much for this. But Isabella, can you tell us what is next for you?
Sure. My elevator pitch is not very refined, but I have a novel that's coming out next summer. I think the title will be Our Names. And it's about, it's in two parts. We decided last night, you know. It will be in two parts. The first part is set in Indonesia in 1955 at the Bandung Conference. And the second half is set in Beirut in 1966. And it's about an Indian photojournalist and a Lebanese secretary, two women, and their friendship. So it's about, this period of third world diplomacy after the decolonization of much of the third world. And yeah, these two sort of marginal women in their friendship. So I don't know how I did there, but I'll get better at it.
That's very good.
That's the novel.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you. Thank you.